Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to class and welcome to week 11. So we'll go ahead and get started. I apologize for the brief delay there. Just want to get everything booted up here and ready to go. And I don't think this will be an extremely long class session, just given my experience with just a class that is only intended to review for the exam. So today's only activity is I'm going to cover some of the material that you can expect to see on this week's exam, which will be available Thursday, sometime after this class ends. And as I noted in my introductory preview note for the week last night in Brightspace, that it'll be available to take in class if you like, or at one of our testing centers on one of the campuses, or if you like, and what most people seem to be doing, is taking in Brightspace, and it'll be available to take through there through Sunday evening by 11:59 p.m. So that seems to be the option that works the best for people. And that's perfectly fine. Actually, what's interesting is that now that we're sort of into this attend anywhere class and are seeing how it's working, and I think the anticipation was that we'd have a lot more people in class and that maybe would attend or choose to view the videos whenever it was more convenient for them if they couldn't make it because of work obligations or something. But it seems like most people like the remote option, either watching on the live link as we have going on right now, or watching the video recording, which either one is perfectly fine. It's entirely up to you. But I think that we had thought that there'd be more people taking exams in class. In fact, that was the project document that sort of laid this out, sort of anticipated that. And I think that that is not necessarily the way things are working out, which is, I don't know if that's a problem at all. I'm just simply saying we make that option available, and I block that day out in case somebody wants to take it. As we go forward with these particular types of formats, it may not be the case that we block those out, and hopefully we don't have to cut any course material because of it. It's generally not my intention, because certainly I've taught this course a lot in the physical campus setting, so we do allow for exam times and whatnot. But and it could be just simply it's a COVID issue where people are reluctant to come to class and whatnot. For various reasons, health reasons and whatnot, so perfectly fine, and so we'll accommodate that. I apologize for my voice. I've got the seasonal allergy thing going on. I don't think I'm sick. I don't have a fever or anything like that, but every year about this time I sort of get this affliction, and it's just something I've got to deal with. I apologize to you for my voice, and I get a little bit of a cough and whatnot, but I think I'll be okay. So let's talk about the exam that's coming up. It's going to be on Thursday. It'll be available. It's going to be the same format as before. So exam 3 will be available basically from 324 to 327, unless you take it in on campus. It's going to cover chapters 11 through 13. So there are only 3 chapters, which is pretty good. I mean, I know that we only had our last exam about 3 weeks ago. So the good news is for this sort of speeded up pace here is the fact that there are fewer chapters to be covered. So that's good news. It's going to be the same format as before, 40 multiple choice questions. And you'll have 90 minutes to complete that if you do it in Brightspace. So 90 minutes. So 90 minutes will be your time frame. This is exactly the same as before. So if you've taken the first 2 exams, or at least one of them, then you're familiar with that whole setup, and it shouldn't be anything there's nothing that's too bizarre about it. And I say if you took one of the 2 exams, because remember, we have 4 exams that are considered intermediate exams, and then we drop the lowest of those in the final grade calculation. And then we have a final exam the very last week of class, sort of that last week in April, and which is about a month from now. And that is not dropped, but the lowest of the first 4 are. So if you didn't take an exam for whatever reason and didn't choose to make it up, because you get a 1-week make-it period, if you do miss it for whatever reason, then you can drop that, or I'll drop the lowest score. So it'll just happen automatically. The computer will do it. So okay. All right. So questions for me is before we get going here, and the exam is pretty much all selected. It's just a matter of uploading it and getting it ready for you on Thursday. What I'll do also is, like last time, I'll have an open Zoom link at 9 o'clock on Thursday. So if you do have any last minute questions as you're preparing for the exam, feel free to pop in and ask your questions. it'll be kind of good because it'll be pretty much you and me, or maybe one other person. It doesn't usually involve a lot of people, but I can spend any time you like going over any graphs or relationships or whatever, and I'm more than glad to do that. So take advantage of that. I know in the second exam, a lot of people might have been a little bit weirded out because it was just kind of me sitting here with a camera on. They didn't quite know what to do about it, and I just said, look, it's just a Q&A session if you do have questions. It's not a regular class session, but I'm here because we scheduled it, and it's on the syllabus for those who want to take the exam in class. So use it if you want, or don't use it, whichever you prefer. It's up to you. And if you want to hit me up before the exam sometime tomorrow or today via email or whatever, email is probably the best way to get a hold of me. And it's also a way which, sort of refreshes my memory if we're doing sort of a back and forth, clarifying questions and whatnot. I can remember at least what we said and all that, because I do get a fair amount of emails, so I can't always remember what everyone's specific question was. But so that's kind of a good way to do it. But you can also call. It's perfectly fine to do that as well. Okay. All right. So let's talk a bit about the exam and what to expect. So chapter 11 deals with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and this notion of equilibrium in the macroeconomy, that is the Y star, that is the equilibrium GDP. So you want to read that chapter. It's probably the most technical chapter, although the other two chapters are theory chapters 12 and 13. One deals with Keynesian economic theory, which was sort of the original worldview of macro, as macro was being developed as something as a breakaway from what was traditional economics that was primarily micro-based. And so Keynesian theory, based upon the work of John Maynard Keynes, sort of held sway for a number of decades. It was sort of challenged by some of the original thinkers in economics in general, and their later followers, known as neoclassicists, who had a sort of a different worldview and sort of a different take on issues like government involved in the economy, whether government should be involved, the degree of effectiveness of government involvement, and what the overall priority of government ought to be, whether it's fighting inflation, as the classicists believe, or fighting unemployment, which the Keynesians believe. So you want to kind of make sure that you've read that. I don't think this is going to be an exam that's going to be that easily completed without having read the exam. I really think that's something you want to do, or without having read the chapters. Okay. Okay, so know what the definition of aggregate supply is. It's simply that relationship between the quantity supplied and the price level. So remember, it's upward sloping, and business firms will supply more output as the price rises, particularly if their input costs are fixed. So remember, the aggregate supply curve is an output curve. And in fact, the Y on the Y-axis is output. In fact, we call it output and income. It's the same thing. And so as the price level rises, business firms are incentivized to produce more output. And they will, because why not? Particularly if their wage costs are fixed, their materials costs are relatively fixed. And so as a result, the short-run aggregate supply curve is considered to be upward sloping. And so they'll provide more of it as the price level rises, because why wouldn't they if they're a business firm? If the price level falls, they'll produce less. And so less output is produced as the price level is falling. So remember, Y is output, Y is also income. So we refer to this GDP figure as Y, which is the same as output, which is the same as income. All those terms are used sort of interchangeably, okay? And then know about this idea of potential GDP, okay? Now your textbook refers to this as being a full employment as potential GDP. If you have aggregate demand in this graph here, then you've got a condition of equilibrium, which we'll go ahead and call Y star. But if it's the maximum that can be produced at a given time, then it's considered to be full employment GDP, which is the same as potential GDP, which I believe your text has as Y sub P. It's the same thing. And so I know that it's sort of maddening at times when economists use different variables for things. The different textbooks can't agree on what to call things, and I understand that's an issue. But for the most part, just consider the fact that if you're operating at potential GDP, it's the GDP at which achieves full employment. And that is, there is no cyclical unemployment in the economy. The only unemployment there is that unemployment which occurs naturally, which is why it's sort of called the natural rate of unemployment. frictional and structural unemployment are going to happen. People are going to lose their jobs for various reasons. They're going to quit their jobs. They're going to be laid off. Their plants are going to close for various reasons. So there's always going to be those people out of work, which has nothing to do with the underlying strength of the economy as a whole. Okay, so potential GDP and full employment GDP are considered to be one and the same. They are in fact synonymous. So make sure that you are aware of that relationship there. Also know what the definition of aggregate demand is. That is the inverse relationship between the quantity demanded of output in the economy and the price level. And this is just the opposite of the short run aggregate supply curve, because as the price level goes down, it becomes more affordable for consumers to buy, and anybody, firms, consumers, government, everyone, to buy more output. And if the price level goes up, it becomes less affordable, and so less output is demanded. And if there's less output, there's less income, because remember, my spending is your income, your spending is my income. So it's that relationship that goes on, which is why we say that output equals income. So that inverse relationship between the price level and total demand for output in the economy, and then know what those factors are. Excuse me, that cause that. Excuse me. Know what those factors are, such as the real balances effect, foreign goods effect, all of those kinds of things. Okay. And we know, of course, that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. That's an important thing to know about. Okay. Also, we had a question, and it dealt with. Let me see if I can swivel this camera a little bit here, because I know we've got some limitations of what we can do here. We talked about something called the Phillips curve, and the Phillips curve basically was this relationship between the inflation rate, and there are actually a number of questions dealing with this. The inflation rate expressed as a percentage, and the unemployment rate is expressed as a percentage. And the Phillips curve relationship basically holds that there's an inverse relationship between the two of these. And that is, if you have high unemployment, then you've got low inflation. So the way to cure high unemployment is to speed the economy up by stepping on the gas with more spending, government spending, lower taxes, all that. And as a result, the unemployment rate falls, but the price level rises, because now the economy is overheating. If there's too much inflation, you slow the economy down through increased taxes, less government spending, and as we'll see later, higher interest rates and all that. So the result, as you bring inflation down, the unemployment rate picks up. So know about that relationship in general. There are a number of questions dealing with it. In fact, there's one question that is that I think there may be one or maybe more questions that will actually show a graph that you'll want to interpret based upon the Phillips curve, but it's a relatively simple model to understand the idea of the Phillips curve. It's this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It's a policy trade-off. What do policymakers do? They try to steer the car between these two ditches. Inflation on the one hand, that's one ditch. Unemployment on the other hand, that's another ditch. Trying to keep it in between, somewhere in the sweet spot here, whatever that is. Now, one of the reasons why this model breaks down in the long run, we say it's a good short-run model, but why it breaks down in the long run is because there was a shifting to the right of this curve back in the, yeah, that's right, in the wrong direction. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, when the entire curve itself was shifting to the right. And so you had really the worst of both worlds. You had high inflation and high unemployment, and that was called stagflation. So it wasn't a trade-off of high inflation, low unemployment, low inflation, high unemployment. It was both at the same time, because the entire curve was shifting, and that was considered to be a real breakdown in the long run relationship. So in the long run, the Phillips curve, it does not have a lot of intellectual and empirical backup, but in the short run, it's a pretty good model for knowing where things are. And if you consider where we are at the moment, we have pretty high inflation, we really do, and very low unemployment. Now, part of that unemployment rate is because of the fact that a number of people have left the labor force. A lot of people are considered to be taking early retirement or just sort of, laying out until maybe the COVID pandemic has passed, so that they, if they're concerned about health and whatnot. Certainly people have their reasons. So the participation rate is down. That is, a lot of people who would be able to work, willing and able, or able, but maybe not willing, would be there otherwise. So perhaps the unemployment rate is a bit lower than what it ought to be because there are people who aren't being accounted for because they're out of the labor force. But nonetheless, there are jobs out there, no question about it. And I would say if you're looking for a job, you might want to think about getting moving because the Federal Reserve has begun just last week to raise interest rates as we knew they would. They were pretty clear about their telegraphing of that. And so it will, no doubt, slow the economy down. And in fact, they are talking about that very thing, slowing demand for goods down. So if you're job hopping or whatever, I don't mean that in a bad way because people leave jobs all the time, or refinancing your house or whatever, now is probably a good time to do it. Okay. Okay, so there's a question about that stagflation condition. Let me see here. So remember that full employment is where there's no cyclical unemployment. The only unemployment are those two types that we talked about earlier, frictional and structural. Also, there's a couple questions there's some graphical questions that are on the exam where there'll be a shift in aggregate demand or aggregate supply. And and it'll be a very clear scenario as to what's happening. And you'll basically want to interpret what's going on. So if aggregate supply maybe is shifting this way, then the price level is falling because maybe there's an improvement in technology or productivity. As a result, more output's being produced at a lower price level because of productivity means lower cost of production. So as a result, you get that. So you want to be able to interpret that. Or if there's a rise in aggregate demand, what could that be due to? Maybe a tax cut. And so as a result, all the buyers, particularly, maybe private sector buyers, households and firms would have more to spend. So as a result, demand more output. And so what happens to the price level? What happens to the output in GDP? Just if you follow along and you can see, it's just a matter of interpretation. So that's why you do want to get familiar with the chapters and the graphs and what they're saying. And if you have questions about them, because I know not everybody is, it likes to see graphs. Some people are very visual, and graphs make it a whole lot easier to sort of follow along with what's being described. Others are more verbal and whatnot, and even still some are more quantitative. So we all sort of learn differently. So if you do have any issues with that, feel free to get with me, and I'll be more than glad to sort of walk through how to interpret these graphs. And there's a reason why I went over that math piece a bit earlier in the class, just to make sure that everyone was familiar with what's really being described there. Okay, so about 2 or 3 questions dealing with that sort of thing there. Also know about equilibrium GDP, which what it is the meeting point between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And this is not that much different than equilibrium quantity in that basic market model that we talked about back in chapter 3, where it was a PQ plane, and the equilibrium Q was where there was no imbalance between demand and supply. Well, here it's very similar. Equilibrium GDP is the condition of balance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply in terms of the quantity of goods that are produced and demanded are the same. Okay, and so there's no giant swing in inventory. And the idea of equilibrium GDP existing is pretty well supported because we do have fairly small swings in inventory throughout the economy. Okay, so questions so far about anything? Okay, there are more chapters. There are more questions on chapter 11 than any of the other questions. And also about the equilibrium price level. It's also the price level that is established by the equilibrium condition. So you want to know how to interpret that. And let me see here. I'm just kind of scrolling through here. Okay. Okay, some of these are very similar to what I've already talked about before. They're just sort of phrased a little bit differently. Okay, there's a question dealing with this notion of, let me sort of change the camera view here a little bit. The long run condition of aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And we said that there is a way, I guess, to reconcile this notion of the long and short run, because one of the things about Keynesian theory from classical theory is that Keynes tends to be more interested in short run, and dealing with, sort of emergency conditions, notably high unemployment. And his feeling was, and those of his later followers, was that the aggregate supply could actually be in the short run to be actually horizontal to the point where you get to full employment, which is somewhere around here. And this would be the potential of full employment GDP. And then the classicists sort of pick up the ball by saying this is the long run aggregate supply curve. So that vertical aggregate supply curve, which we talked about in this chapter, is really sort of a classical interpretation, because the classicists are more concerned with the long run conditions than the short run. They're not worried so much about unemployment and whatnot. They're worried about long-term inflationary conditions. So right now, neoclassicists are probably very worried about the idea the price level has been rising, and it doesn't seem to be coming down. And we're talking about the prices for a lot of goods, not just gasoline, which I know we've all had to deal with, but a lot of goods. And so in a lot of ways, then we simply refer to this as the neoclassical region or the classical region, whichever you prefer, and this particular horizontal area as the Keynesian region. Just because there are different focuses on time frame. The time frame is very important in these particular interpretations of sort of macro worldview. Okay, and I guess the good news about the video is that you can stop this if you like and sort of copy that. But if you don't have this, I'll leave that up there for those of you who are watching the live link. I'm sort of moving between boards here because I've got my laptop here, which is where the test is, and so I want to be able to look at it from there. So, okay, all right. So let me see here. I think that pretty much does it for the questions dealing with chapter 11. There is some carryover into the other chapters, where there's some sort of regurgitation of those. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about some other things here. So let's see. Okay. All right. When it comes to Keynesian theory, what Keynes was really the first to do, we talked about this, was to sort of talk about what aggregate demand really is. What is aggregate demand? It's basically the combination of consumption, investment, government spending, and the difference between exports and imports. So this is not anything different than why GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. We saw that back earlier, like in chapter 6, when we first talked about national income accounting. And this is the expenditures approach. Remember, demand is measured by expenditures. That's how we evidence demand, is by what people and firms are spending money on, and businesses and foreign buyers and whatnot. And so aggregate demand, at equilibrium at least, is the same as GDP. So you want to know what those elements are, because they're all elements of aggregate demand, okay? And then one of the big differentiating factors between Keynesian theory and classical theory is this idea of sticky, that is inflexible prices and wages, and flexible prices and wages. In the Keynesian worldview, prices and wages they're considered sticky, and by sticky we mean they get sort of gummed up. They don't move very flexibly. They can't just adjust very quickly. And some of the reasons why are discussed in the books, things like menu costs. Menu costs are basically the cost of changing prices all the time. Firms don't like to change prices. It costs money to do that sometimes, particularly if you've got printed items that you're preparing for people. It's too difficult if prices continue to change, particularly if prices come down. Also, when it comes to wages that are sticky on the downside, a lot of workers don't like to take wage cuts. And so we'll resist wage cuts. And we'd rather see unemployment happen of others than taking wage cuts, which goes against the classical view. When the classical view says that these wages and prices are flexible, they will move. And in the classical worldview, if there's unemployment, workers will take lower wages, and the lower wages will allow firms to hire more workers, which cures the unemployment problem. And as the economy moves back to full employment, which is the natural state of things, this idea of full employment GDP is the natural condition. And if the economy gets out of whack for whatever reason, it finds its way back there without government involvement. That's the big issue there. That firms will lower prices to move inventory, and workers will take lower wages. Keynes said that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. They're considered to be sticky. So you want to know what that is and what the differences between those are, because that's really an important differentiating factor between the two theories, among a lot of other things, like the issue of government involvement that I just talked about. Okay, so you want to know about that whole issue of price stickiness versus price flexibility, and whether or not an economy will move back to full employment, also known as the natural rate of unemployment, also known as potential GDP. It's all really the same thing. Keynes said it does not work its way back. It does not self-correct, in his words, that you need government involvement to push it along to get it there, because it gets jammed up, it gets stuck. That if consumers and businesses won't spend, government is the spender of last resort in order to push the economy to GDP, full employment GDP. Whereas in the classical worldview, government's not needed. In fact, government is inflationary because I moved my camera again. So government action here in the classical worldview, government action is considered to be not helpful. That is, all these additions to aggregate demand just end up raising the price level and do nothing to GDP. Whereas in the Keynesian view, price level does not change, but you do move toward greater GDP. So they're pretty starkly different views. One is a conception of aggregate supply that's horizontal, the other which is vertical. So I don't see how you can get too much different in that sort of understanding of how things work. But they're pretty separate. So classicists believe that government involvement that pushes demand higher because of tax cuts, government spending, and government spending is a big is a big boogeyman to them. They don't like a lot of government spending because it creates inflation in their view, which does not help. It just creates distortion, and it does not create full employment. Okay. Okay. So let me see here. Keynesians offer a policy prescription, whereas the classicists say there's no policy prescription needed. And again, I've said this numerous times that whenever in macroeconomics we talk about policy, we're almost always talking about government policy, because we are dealing with the entire economy. And so there is no individual actor, business firm, or household that can really make an impact on the economy. Even the largest economic actors really can't make an impact on the broader economy. It's got to be government action, because government is what ties everything together and can move with great speed and great impact, and can do so when there's no incentive for private actors to do anything of the sort. Okay. Questions so far about anything? You can. I know I can't hear you, but you can put something in the chat box, and I'll be more than glad to respond if you do have questions. Let me see here. So government spending is good in the Keynesian worldview. It's not in the classical worldview. So just kind of know about that whole issue there, because that's an important aspect of it. Also, this idea that Keynes argued against, this idea of flexible wages and prices, is the idea there's no mechanism to coordinate all of this. We talked about this particularly with regard to wages, where we said that how would workers accept lower wages? Would they all get together and say, oh, okay, we'll take a 20% wage cut? Would they get together in a big room? Would all workers get together throughout the country somehow and agree to take a wage cut so that unemployment could go away? And would all business firms get together and agree on a price cut? That might actually be illegal, getting business firms together to agree on price changes. If you've taken micro before, you'll see that firms cooperating on prices is a big no-no too, because it could be considered collusion. So there's no mechanism by which coordination can happen. That's really considered to be an issue there in the Keynesian worldview, which contributes to the stickiness of wages and prices, because everyone's sort of looking out for their own interests, and why wouldn't they? And the broader interests really don't factor in, and there's no real means to do it. Are you concerned about a worker in New York State that you don't know? You get the idea. It's really difficult to sort of make that leap of logic in the Keynesian worldview. Okay. Okay. Let me see here. I'm scrolling through. I didn't choose all the ones I kind of cut some out that I was going to use earlier, so I'm kind of scrolling through a little bit. We talked about the Phillips curve, so know what the Phillips curve is. There are probably 3 or 4 questions dealing with that when it's asking about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So you want to know what that's happening. Also, know about the idea of the recessionary gap. And so I'm just going to swivel this over here a minute, because the first to really talk about that was Keynes, who said that, look, if you're operating somewhere below full employment is right here, then any kind of difference between actual, which we'll call Y0, and full employment GDP is considered to be an output gap. The output gaps can be positive or negative, because you can have an output gap out here where the economy is operating well above full employment GDP. So an output gap doesn't have to be negative, but typically that's the main focus of Keynesian theory, is the economy operating suboptimally. This is also known as a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap. That is the difference between actual GDP when it's less than full employment GDP. The idea is to try to expand aggregate demand on spending on things like government spending, tax cuts, healthcare, government programs to support students and elderly and people who are unemployed, people who need medical assistance. All those kinds of things are a lot of them are social spending items, frankly, that will help push the economy along to full GDP. And some of those are more of the neoclassical variety, because Keynes himself said that it really doesn't matter what the government spends money on, because spending is spending and dollars are dollars. And so once the economy starts getting fresh dollars flowing around, it'll sort of kickstart the economy. And Keynes was a believer in just getting this thing, sort of jump started, so the government can step back and let the private actors do their job. And when they do their job, fine. But he's saying they don't always do their job, because the economy is inherently unstable. Unlike the classical worldview that says the economy is mostly stable, mostly at or near full employment, and if it's out of full employment, it'll find its way back there. It doesn't need government to hold its hand. And a lot of people don't like that particular sort of criticism that the classicists have, but nonetheless, that is their particular worldview. Okay. I was looking to see if there are any questions for me on the chat box. I'm sorry I can't hear you. I know that's a real problem, but hopefully as we roll out more technology, we'll be able to fix this problem and also standardize the equipment so that we all can have the same capability and whatnot. So, okay. Let me see here. Also know about the multiplier effect. We talked a little bit about this. The multiplier is basically this. It's this idea that some change in GDP is achieved that's greater than some change in aggregate demand. And so if you get, say, 1.5 times over 1, then the multiplier is 1.5, right? So if it's 1.5 trillion out of a $1 trillion stimulus, then 1.5 is the multiplier. The multiplier is a number. It's not a factor. It's not a percentage. It's not a dollar figure. It's just a number. It just says, if you take that change in stimulus times 1.5, you get the end result. That is, the change in GDP is 1.5. You can reword these terms here and say that the change in aggregate demand times the multiplier equals the change in GDP. And so if the change in this is $1 trillion times 1.5, then change in GDP is 1.5 trillion. Or if it's 2, it's 2 trillion. If it's 3, it's 3 trillion, whatever that multiplier is. So the multiplier is simply the change in expenditure that ripples its way through the economy, because the idea is that one bit of spending doesn't stop, that it's just like this idea of unleashing more and more spending. You start spending, other people start spending, because my spending is your income, your spending is my income, and we all start to spend as more people start spending. And remember, the multiplier is all about demand and pushing its way through the economy. Then we get a bigger bang for the buck once all this spending and the results of that are realized in the economy. Okay, so there's a question about that. I know that there's not a whole lot of discussion in the text about it, but it's just important to know what that is and what the impact is going to be on the economy, just realizing that there is a ripple effect that happens. Okay. Okay, let me see. I think that is about all that I've got on this area here. Okay, let's talk about mostly classical theory here for minutes. So we talked about this idea that the neoclassicists are more into the long run performance of the economy. Keynesians more concerned about the short run. Keynes himself said, in the long run, we're all dead. So he focused, and he's famous for that quote. So he focuses a lot on the short run. So you want to know about that. And then the classicists believe that the economy will return to full employment, which is also called the natural rate of unemployment. Oh, by the way, the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate, which corresponds to a GDP, which is at full employment. So GDP is a dollar figure. So at full employment GDP, the dollar figure of output and income equals the natural rate of unemployment, or it's equivalent to the condition in which there's a natural rate of unemployment. That is, there's no cyclical unemployment. There's no unemployment due to a recessionary gap. There is unemployment, but there's no unemployment that's due to a bad economy, because there are always going to be some people unemployed. What that natural rate of unemployment is been a subject of debate. I think today, most economists will put it around 4.5%. Somewhere between 4 and 5%, but that number has been a moving target over a lot of years, where I think I told the class earlier that at one point, I think economists were thinking maybe 7% was the natural rate. Today, I think 7% would be considered very high, and we can live with maybe 4 to 5% as more natural, as a natural rate of unemployment. Okay, let me see. Okay, again, you can feel free to type in your questions there if you like. Flexible wages and prices are a hallmark of classical thinking. Let's see here. The classicists are way more concerned about inflation. The neoclassicists are more concerned about inflation than unemployment, and Keynesians are more concerned about unemployment than inflation. So know that, and that's just by looking at that long run model, should be obvious that there are two bad things that are happening. The Keynesians are worried about not getting enough employment, and the classicists are worried about too much inflation. So that is something that you will want to sort of focus on there. Let me see here. Know about the vertical configuration of aggregate supply. That's sort of a classical notion, okay, which is why we call it the classical region. Let me see here. Getting pretty close to the end here of what I've got to talk about. Okay, classicists are worried that increases in aggregate demand will increase inflation. So those increases, excuse me, stimulating the aggregate demand is not necessary. So policy prescriptions are not part of their framework, except for the fact that we talked a bit about monetarism and monetary theory. We'll talk more about that later. There's no question on monetarism here. We'll return a bit to monetary theory a bit later. Okay, there's a question dealing with the rational expectations theory, what that's about. Rational expectations theory is a sort of a sub-theory within classical theory that basically says that actors in the economy, private actors, will anticipate the effects of government actions and take steps to make their own situation better, but as a result will counter those policy directives. And as a result, policy tends to be less effective than what it might be because of the fact that people anticipate what government's going to do. So if they expect government to spend more money, they expect it to be inflationary. So firms will demand higher prices up front. Workers will demand higher wages, and all those kinds of things. Those are considered inflationary expectations. That's really one of the concerns about the RET, rational expectations theory. It's a pretty deep theory. There's a lot of different elements to it. Even the Keynesians have their own particular spin on rational expectations, but we won't get into that. It's really maybe a next class view to the further macro. Let me see here. There's no self-correcting mechanism in Keynesian theory. There is the classical view. Let's see here. I think that's about it. Because some of these are asking questions in different ways. And so I believe that is all that I have to go over with regard to the exam. And I think that if you are able to sort of incorporate some of these ideas and items into your studying, you should be fine. Obviously, since most of you will do it at home, you have the online text that you can view as you're doing it. you've got 90 minutes, and I would sort of urge you not to, to be familiar with it and be ready for the exam, because I know sometimes open book exams, a lot of instructors are reluctant to do it because they think that people are, simply wait till the exam and sort of look everything up. There's a time limit, you don't have time. And I gather that that's not necessarily what we're seeing with a lot of our students, but I guess there are exceptions. But you want to, the questions you do know, just knock those out quickly if you're prepared, and you should be able to answer them if, some of the things we talked about. If they're a little bit more tricky, maybe save those and come back to them. You do have 90 minutes, which I think is probably adequate time for 40 questions, so you should be fine. Some of these probably won't take you very long at all to answer, particularly if you're well prepared. And there's nothing like being well prepared for an exam and being confident going in. There's no question here that is really just off the charts weird that I know, at least in my opinion. Now, if you have a different opinion, let me know and I'll take a look at it. Sometimes there are questions that I think are perfectly reasonable that others don't, but that doesn't come up all that often. But if it does, that's fine. I'm not unreasonable in that regard. So anyway, the exam will be available Thursday. I'll be here on Thursday with an open link if you want to, get with me. And I'm available also. I'm on campus pretty much every day during the week, so feel free to get with me as well. Does anybody have any questions? Those of you who are on the live Zoom link, anything I can answer? Since I can't hear you, you can just type it in the chat box. Okay, well, this is not your last opportunity. You have other chances to get with me. So I think I'll wrap it up from there. And if anybody does have questions, again, feel free to get with me. Otherwise, I'll say good luck to you, and I'll see you later on during the week. And good luck to you all with the exam. Okay, all right, see you next time.